Hello Year 10 and welcome to your lesson this week, which is on how does a country's population change over time. By the end of the lesson you should be able to describe population growth, you should be able to explain the development of each stage of something called the demographic transition model, and you should be able to link that to a country's economic growth. So, if we have a look at this slide just here, this graph shows us the world population over the last 12,000 years. And you can see that about 10,000 years before before the Common Era, we have about 4 million people in the world. And you can see that the population of the world stays really slow. So for millennia, there were less than 500 million people. By the year zero, there was only 190 million. And we didn't really reach 1 billion people until after 1800. So 990 million was reached in 1800, 1 billion shortly after them. And then you can see the population skyrockets. So all of a sudden, in the last 200 years, the population increases exponentially up until today's population, which is about 7.7 billion people. So we need to think about why. Why is it that population grows in this way? Why is it that for so long there were so few people, and then all of a sudden the population increases exponentially? Okay, so there are a few terms which you need to understand, so I'm going to let you look those up on Cool Geography following the link there. You might be able to work out what some of them mean anyway. So crude birth rate is the number of live births per 1,000 people. The crude death rate is the number of deaths per 1,000 people. We're going to look at what the demographic transition model is in this lesson. Life expectancy is the number of years people can expect to live for, and family planning, I'm going to put the G on there as soon as I finish making this video, is the ability to control birth. Okay? Right. Now, I'm going to ask you to watch this video. This video sort of gives you some idea of how population has grown over time and what factors lead to changes in birth rates over time and what factors reduce the death rate over time. So a really interesting little video which shows how the population has grown at different paces in different parts of the world. Now if we think about that, you'll be able to see, once you've seen that video, it will confirm this to you. So if we look at the blue part on the graph, that's the more developed regions of the Earth, the high income countries. And you can see their population in 1950 was just below 1 billion. It's increased slightly, it hasn't changed that much. And if you look carefully, it's showing you that by 2050 it might actually be decreasing slightly. So the number of people will be going down in the high income countries. If you look at the low income countries, that's the part of the graph in red, then in 1950 there's probably about 1.5 billion people living in low income countries, and that has increased quite rapidly up to today, and then carry on increasing up until 2050. But you'll notice that by 2050 the rate of growth in population in low income countries is actually due to slow. And we're going to have a look at the reasons for that. Okay, so Right, now, the thing that explains this to us is something called the demographic transition model, which is this graph, which you can see on the x-axis we've got time. On the left-hand side, on the y-axis, sorry, we've got the death rate per thousand population, and we've got a second y-axis, which shows us the birth rate per thousand population. So the blue line on the graph shows us birth rate, the green line on the graph shows us death rate, and total population is indicated by the orange line, although you can't really read that off either of the axes. That's just there to show you what happens to the size of the total population. Now we're going to have a look in a little bit more detail at this graph and what it all means, what the title of it means, and then go through it stage by stage to see what happens. So, demographers are people who study population, and they've studied population in lots of different countries around the world, and they've noticed that similar patterns can be spotted in each country. And we go from a situation where in stage 1, birth and death rates are both really high, and then we go through this transition to a stage where birth and death rates are both really low in stage 4. Now this is known as the demographic transition. Demographic just means something to do with population. Transition means a change in state from one way to another, and demographers have modelled this transition, hence we end up with a demographic transition model. And there are 5 stages to it. What we're going to do now is we're going to look at each of those stages in turn. Okay, so if we look at stage 1, stage 1 is Britain before about 1750. So quite a long time ago now, and in the modern world, there aren't that many populations which you describe as being in stage 1. Just remote tribes that live in the Amazon rainforest, for example, they might still be in stage 1. And in stage 1, the death rate is really quite high, and this is because of diseases spreading, hunger, and poor nutrition. Because of that, life expectancy is really low. Most children don't survive until they are adults. Now that means that people have lots of children. They need to have lots of children because most of them will die before they grow up, and also they need children to work. Okay, so children help you work in the fields, they help grow crops, they help your family survive. So it's very important to have lots of children. Now, because the birth and death rate are roughly the same, the population, the total population, if you look at the orange line, is really low. Okay, so it's really low. It's really low, and it stays low. Okay, so stage 2 then. If we have a look at stage 2, something begins to happen. So in stage 2, the death rate starts to fall. Now this is caused by a number of different factors. So there are improvements in farming. So in 1750, around about 1750 in the UK, new farm machinery was invented. Better techniques of farming were invented, and that started to mean that the food supply improved. So not everybody needed to be growing food. So it meant that people were available to do other kinds of work. Now initially, what lots of people started doing was textiles, making cloth in their own homes. Okay, so using wool that they'd farmed to make cloth. And this is kind of a typical thing that happens. Also, sanitation improves. So people start to realise that there's a need for sanitation, particularly in towns. So people start to dispose of sewage and waste in a better way. There also tends to be improvements in medicine at this stage, so people survive for longer. Okay, so vaccines have started around this sort of time in the UK, starting with smallpox. The birth rate, however, remains high. People are used to having large families, there's no contraception, and women are expected to bear children in this sort of society. So some countries in Africa are in this stage of the demographic transition at the moment. And like I said, Britain, after about 1750, was in this kind of stage. Okay. Moving on then to stage 3. So in stage 3, death rate, which is our green line, continues to fall. This is because of further improvements in the food supply, better sanitation, improvements in medicine, healthcare becoming widely available. But you'll notice the birth rate in this stage starts to fall as well. So this is because more children survive, so there's no need to have as many. And as I said, improvements in agriculture mean you don't need as many children to help you farm. You don't need as many children to help you go out and earn the family money. Also, children become expensive, because the government passes laws saying things like, oh, you've got to send your children to school. So if you have to send your children to school, you have to buy them uniform and books, and they're not earning your family money. So having lots of children becomes an economic disadvantage. And having few children is advantageous economically. Another thing happens around this sort of time in society. So society is evolving at the same time, and the status of women changes. Okay, so during the 19th century and into the 20th century, the role of women changed. If you think about suffragettes that you might have learned about in history, that happened in the early part of the 20th century. And then during the First World War, lots of women did jobs which were traditionally considered to be men's jobs. And that had a real transforming effect on society. So people realised that women were very capable. Women started to go to university a lot more, started to stay in school a lot more. Now, it happens all around the world that as women's rights improve and female literacy improves and things like that, then women start to have fewer children. Now, in order for this to happen, you also need to have family planning or contraception become available so people can restrict the number of children that they have. So we've got a falling birth rate. That means that the population carries on growing rapidly through this time, but the rate of growth will begin to slow. Now, if you remember what I said from one of the previous slides, if you view the whole world as a whole, then we're kind of in this stage at the moment. So birth rates around the world are coming down, death rates are coming down too. The population is still growing rapidly, but the rate of growth in the next few years, next few decades, will start to slow down. Okay, if we move on to stage 4. So in stage 4, birth and death rates stabilise at about the same rate. So this is where Britain is today, and lots of other countries. Now, because the birth and death rate are roughly equal, the total population stabilises and population stops growing exponentially. What does happen, however, is because of longer life expectancy, the population ages, so the average age of the population increases. So in the UK now we have lots of people over the age of 60, and that number, the percentage of the population over 60, is going to increase. This has led to demographers noting or suggesting a stage 5. And stage 5 has been experienced by some countries, notably Japan. So in stage 5, most people choose to have only 1 or 2 children. This is below replacement level. Now you might think that replacement level is the number of children that you need in order to continue the population at its current level. Now, if each couple has 2 children, that is below replacement level because not all of those children will grow into adults and have children themselves. So for a population to replace itself, you need each couple to have more than 2 children. On average, it's about 2.5. All right. So if most couples are only having 1 or 2 children, then the population will shrink. There'll be a continuing the aging of the population, so the average age of people will increase. The number of people of childbearing age decreases, and the death rate starts to rise over the birth rate simply because there are so many older people. And the birth rate will fall, because people are choosing to have fewer children. In Japan, what's happened is because it's been quite difficult to have children arrange childcare businesses have closed, and that makes it even harder for families to have children. So people are having fewer and fewer children. Okay. Right, next up then, there's a little exam question for you to do. It's quite straightforward. It says, which sentence of the model does the following sentence describe? As the standard of living rises, the birth rate falls rapidly and the death rate remains low. So you just need to look which stage of the demographic transition that describes. Okay, your next task after that then is read the information on the demographic, the DTM information cards, that's on your Google Classroom, and use the information to complete the DTM Worksheet 1. When you've done DTM Worksheet 1, you can have a go at doing DTM Worksheet 2. Okay, so that's your first set of tasks really. Now, any model has limitations. Limitations are things which mean that it might not be as useful as you first think. Okay, so the limitations of the demographic transition model are that it was developed using high income country examples. Not all low income countries might follow the same pattern. One thing that has changed is, if you remember, I said that Britain started the demographic transition in about 1750 and it reached stage 4 probably after the Second World War, so in the 50s, 1950s. So it's taken about 200 years to get through the demographic transition. If we look at a country like India, India started the demographic transition in about 1950 and is already coming towards the end of stage 3 and moving into stage 4. So what seems to happen now is the demographic transition happens much more rapidly. Now that could be because the technology doesn't need inventing. So as Britain was going through the demographic transition, new technology was being invented that improved society. Now all that technology is available, it's just a matter of having the cash to buy it these days. Another thing that might limit it is the HIV/AIDS epidemic in sub-Saharan Africa. So that causes people to die at a much younger age than otherwise would be expected, as many people don't have access to antiretroviral drugs which prevent the development of the disease. Some countries have instigated policies, so they put policies in place to try and limit the number of children that people have, or try and encourage people to have more children. The model doesn't take into account that. And also the model doesn't take into account migration. Okay, so moving on then, we need to know how the demographic transition model links to development. So the two things are linked. Economic development and the demographic transition are very closely linked together. And some of the things which cause the changes in the demographic transition, so for example, cause the death rate to fall, also lead to economic development. So for example, if you think back, one of the things I said that caused the death rate to fall was improvements in agriculture, which meant that more food was available. Now that also means that if there's more food available, there's a surplus that you can sell. So that helps economic development. So the two are very, very closely linked. Now, we're going to compare the demographic transition to Rostow's model of economic development. So Rostow studied a number of countries and came up with a 5-stage model. They're not exactly as the 5 stages of the demographic transition model, but they're very closely linked. And Rostow's model shows that over time, as a country goes through a series of transformations, that helps the economy grow. Now, lots of those things are the same transformations that affect the population. Okay, so we're going to have a look at some number of events and think about their effect on the population and on the economy. So, if we go back in time to a traditional society, most people are subsistence farmers. That means they grow their own food. There's very poor standards of hygiene and medicine. Now, the impact on the economy of that is that most people have to spend most of their time growing food. There's no time to do any of the work. Children have to take part in that as well, so there's no time for children to be educated, meaning people are poorly skilled. That means you can only have low-tech industries. Most people are employed in agriculture. Moving on then, so mechanisation improves agriculture. That means using machines in farms. There's improvements in medicine and hygiene. As we said before, that means the death rate falls. People become fitter. If you're fitter, you can work harder. Okay? So people are no longer needed to work in farming as much because there's these machines to do the jobs instead. This means they're available to do other work. They often work to begin with in textiles, making cloth. Okay, moving on. We've got a rural-urban shift. So people are no longer needed in the countryside. So if we use the example of Britain, in the 1780s and the 1790s, there was a huge unemployment crisis. People were wandering around the country looking for work. But new machines were invented also in factories, which enabled factories to happen. So the birth rate would fall, children become educated, women start to participate in the labour market, and the economy starts to boom. Okay? So this is when urbanisation happens. We end up with lots of people living in cities. We've then got self-sustained economic growth, and the service sector begins to grow. That's working in banking, insurance and finance. The economy is self-sustaining. That means it can continue to grow. So people spending money means more businesses open, which means more people spend money, which means more businesses open. It becomes a self-fulfilling virtuous circle. Because the need for work, to go out to work, most parents have small families because you have to educate your children as well. And also people want to work, people want to have careers and look and follow their careers. Okay, and then we've got what we end up with, a consumer society. So an age of mass consumption where people, the richest people in the world, are buying things, buying consumer goods, and spending their money on services as well, like going on holidays, pension plans, insurances, things like that. So most people have worked in the service industry. Primary industries have moved elsewhere in the world. So primary and secondary industries now take place in other places. And the effect on population is we've got a falling population, falling birth rate and an ageing population because people prioritise other things over having a family. So you can see from that, hopefully, that the changes which cause the demographic transition to happen are also the changes which cause economic development to happen. So you've got an exam question to do here. This actually appeared on the 2018 exam paper, and people actually answered it very poorly because they weren't able to link the two things together. They weren't able to link the demographic transition and a country's level of development together well enough. Okay, so we've got a graph which shows time and income, and the amount of income increases over time. So the country that's shown on this graph is developing. And across the top, they're showing the stages of the different stages of the demographic transition. So what you need to do to answer this question is explain how the two things are linked. So it says, study the diagram below, a simplified model of the link between the demographic transition model and economic development. Using the diagram and your own knowledge, explain the link between the DTM and a country's level of development. So you're going to need to go through the stages explaining what's causing the changes in population and what's causing the changes to the economy, just like we did on the previous slide. Okay, now I've put a structure strip list there, so this is it's a 4-mark question. So I've put what was the changes between stage 1 and stage 2, how did this affect the population, and how did it affect economic development. So for example, you might want to say that one change between stage 1 and stage 2 was improvements in agriculture. This affected population because it decreased the death rate as people became better fed. As people became better fed, they lived longer and were better able to work. So that helped to improve the economy. They also became available to do different types of work other than farming. And often this work was textiles. So you're just going through explaining what I've explained. Okay? Right, I hope that helps. If you've got any questions, please feel free to ask. We're only too happy to help.